The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time long ago, there lived a shoemaker. He was an honest shoemaker and worked very hard. But no matter how hard he tried, he only got poorer and poorer. One day, he had nothing left but a bit of leather, just enough for a pair of shoes. That night, before going to bed, he cut the leather into pieces. He would use the leather the next day to make his last pair of shoes. He laid the pieces carefully on his workbench. "Tomorrow I will wake up early and be ready to make my shoes," he said. Then he and his wife left the shop and went home to eat a small meal and go to bed. The next morning, when the shoemaker and his wife returned to the shop, they found that the pieces of leather were no longer on the workbench. Instead, to their surprise and joy, there was a beautiful new pair of perfectly made shoes. The shoemaker looked at the shoes and found that they were much better than any he had ever made. Who could have done this, wondered the shoemaker's wife. In a short while, an elegant man entered the shop. He tried on the shoes and was so pleased that he offered a handsome price for them. The shoemaker took the money and bought enough leather for 2 pairs of shoes. That night, the shoemaker again cut the leather for shoes to make the next day. He carefully laid out the pieces on the workbench. Then he went home. And the next morning, when he and his wife returned to the shop, there was 2 pairs of shoes waiting on the workbench. These shoes were even more beautiful than the ones that he had found the day before. Soon, a fine man and an elegant lady came into the shop. "What lovely shoes!" exclaimed the lady. She and the gentleman were so delighted that they paid an even higher price for the shoes than the man the day before. Now the shoemaker was able to buy enough leather to make 4 pairs of shoes. And so it went, night after night. The shoemaker would cut leather for more and more shoes. He would carefully lay out the pieces, and each morning there would be a row of handsome shoes waiting on his workbench. The word spread all around the countryside about the shoemaker's fine shoes. People began coming from far and wide to see for themselves and buy shoes at his shop. Before long, the shoemaker and his wife were no longer poor. In fact, they were becoming very rich indeed. They had enough money to eat well and buy new clothes. They could hardly believe their good fortune. Then one evening, a few weeks before Christmas, the shoemaker said to his wife, "How I would like to know who is making such fine shoes for us. Let us stay awake tonight and find out." "An excellent idea," said his wife. "I would love to know who has been helping us all of these nights." So the shoemaker and his wife went to the shop that very night. They took a candle and set it on a table near the workbench. "We must hide ourselves," said the shoemaker. They crouched behind some clothes hanging in the corner of the room, and there they waited. At the stroke of midnight, as the shoemaker and his wife watched, 2 little elves wearing thin and tattered clothes came into the shop. They immediately jumped onto the workbench and began their work. How their fingers flew as they stitched and hammered and pounded away. The shoemaker and his wife could hardly believe their eyes. The elves didn't stop until all leather was made into shoes. When they had finished with their work, they swept up all of the scraps of leather and left the workbench as they found it. Then, in a twinkling, they jumped down and scurried out the shop. The next morning, the shoemaker's wife said, "Those 2 little elves have done so much for us. We should make a gift for them to show our thanks. They must be cold with their ragged clothes, so I will make 2 suits and hats. Will you make 2 tiny pairs of boots for them?" "Of course," said the shoemaker. So they set to work to make clothes for the elves. The wife made 2 handsome coats of green wool. Then she sewed 2 tiny shirts of the finest cloth. She made 2 little hats and trimmed each one with a jaunty feather. She knitted 2 pairs of warm stockings. The shoemaker sewed 2 pairs of little boots. That night they laid out their gifts on the workbench. At midnight, sure enough, the two little elves came skipping into the shop, ready for work. They looked at the workbench, expecting to find pieces of leather to make into shoes. But when they saw the beautiful tiny clothes, they were puzzled at first. Then their surprise turned into delight. They quickly began to dress themselves into the suits and shirts and little hats and boots. As they put on their clothes, they started to dance a lively jig. They hopped about and clapped their hands with glee. Then they began to sing. Now we are the jaunty gentlemen. Why should we ever work again? As soon as they were dressed, they started dancing faster and faster. They hopped and laughed and sang until at last they twirled right out the door of the shop. The shoemaker and his wife watched them dance down the snow-covered moonlit path. The shoemaker smiled and said, "I wonder if we will ever see them again." "Perhaps not," answered his wife, "but how glad I am that we were able to repay them for all that they have done for us. This is our happiest Christmas." The shoemaker and his wife never did see the two little elves again. From that day on, though, the two of them had very good luck in all that they did, and they never forgot those who helped them when they needed it the most. The two little elves.